According to the US Federal Reserve, the net worth of the average American is under $200,000. And even for the wealthiest age group, those who are aged 65 to 70 years old, the average net worth is only $409,900. And that's a huge problem because if you put your information into a retirement calculator like this one, you will probably see that you need at least $1 million to retire, and probably way more. But the good news is that it's actually possible to retire on much less than $1 million. In fact, this is a huge reason that I'll be able to retire before I turn 30 years old. Because there is no way I'll have $1 million by then unless everyone smashes the like and subscribe button. But that's okay, because I should be able to retire early before I'm a millionaire. So in this video, I'll explain how to retire on less than $1 million, 3 strategies you can use to reduce how much money you need to retire without reducing your expenses, and my own plan to retire on just $714,285.71 or less. But to talk about how to retire on less than $1 million, we first need to talk about how to even calculate how much money you need to retire in the first place. Basically, you'll be able to retire when you can maintain your current lifestyle for the rest of your life without running out of money. And instead of burying all of your cash in your backyard, you'll probably want to invest. This makes it way easier to retire because your money can continue to make you wealthier even after you quit your job. This will at least partially offset your expenses, and it will help you keep up with inflation, which is really important, especially if you're planning for a long retirement. And after being adjusted for inflation, the stock market has averaged a 6 to 7% return per year. But it can be a little unpredictable. So the rule of thumb is that you can safely withdraw 4% of your investment portfolio for a 30-year retirement. So what that means is that you need to save 25 times your annual expenses before you retire. And if you want to be a little safer than that, or if you're planning on a very long retirement, then saving more than that is not a bad idea. So to retire on less than $1 million, you would need to spend less than $40,000 per year. And to some of you, that might sound pretty easy. But to others of you, that might sound impossible. So before I explain 3 ways to reduce how much money you need to save for retirement without reducing your expenses, I first want to explain how you could live on $40,000 per year. Because if you can do this, you can retire on less than $1 million. The average single person in the US spends $56,000 per year. But looking at their expenses, it would actually be easy to spend way less. I've made a ton of videos on how to save more money, and I put a guide in the description that breaks down 50 different ways I save over $50,000 per year. But there are just 2 really big expenses that almost everybody could save way more money on. And the first strategy is the easiest way to save more money. Last year, I spent less than 1/3 as much as the average person on this. That's because the average person eats out at restaurants multiple times per week, and when they do their own grocery shopping, they way overpay at the grocery store. That's why the average person spends about $6,900 per year on this. But I spend closer to $2,000, which saves me thousands of dollars per year. And the second way to save more money could be even more powerful. One of my friends pays over $2,000 per month for a really nice 2-bedroom apartment with a view. But this doesn't make any sense to me because she lives alone and hardly has any guests. She could save thousands of dollars per year just by moving to a 1-bedroom apartment, or at least splitting rent with a roommate, which is what I do. But for some reason, the average person is spending just over $20,000 per year on housing. And that's totally unnecessary. So just between food and housing, the average person could save an extra $9,000 to $10,000 per year. And by spending less on entertainment, driving less, and shopping for clothes less frequently, it would be pretty easy for the average American to get their expenses under $40,000 per year. And again, if you spend less than $40,000 per year, then you can probably retire on less than $1 million. So retiring on less than $1 million is totally doable, even for the average person. And if you're frugal, you can probably retire on even less. I'll explain how I plan to do that in a moment. But living on less than $40,000 per year might still sound really tough, especially if you have a family. But the good news is that there are 3 strategies you can use to massively reduce how much money you need to save for retirement without reducing your expenses. The first thing to keep in mind is that working is actually really expensive. And that means that after you quit your job, you might be able to spend thousands less dollars per year without reducing your standard of living. And there are really three big reasons that working is so expensive. And for the first, I'll use myself as an example. I have a high-paying job, but this job comes with a lot of costs, like having to live in one of the most expensive counties in America. Since so many of the high-paying jobs are concentrated in big cities, the cost of living becomes extremely high. For as long as I still have to work, I have to live in an area where the average rent is about $3,000 per month. But there is no way I would live in an area that is this expensive if I didn't have to work. And the second big cost, which is almost just as important, is the cost of transportation. Because most people do the majority of their transportation during their morning and evening commute. And where I live, most of my coworkers have a 45-minute to hour-and-a-half commute each way. And not only is that a huge amount of time, that's also really expensive. I estimate that my coworkers spend about $9,000 per year just commuting. But that is all savings as soon as you quit your job. And the third expense that might decrease once you quit your job is the cost of raising a family. I was talking to my boss the other day, and he said that he's spending $2,500 per month on childcare. But since both he and his wife work full-time, they don't really have another option. But again, if you retire early, some of these expenses might disappear. So just between the cost of living, the cost of transportation, and the cost of raising a family, quitting your job could literally reduce your annual expenses by $20,000 to $30,000 per year, if not more. This makes it way easier to retire on less than $1 million, even if that seems impossible with your current lifestyle. And these aren't even the only costs associated with working. In fact, one of the biggest expenses is taken out of your paycheck before you ever get it. Taxes are one of the largest expenses that you will ever pay, which brings us to the second way to reduce how much money you need for retirement. Because last year, I spent more in taxes than I spent on all of my other expenses combined. And that's because where I live, an income of $100,000 before taxes would be just $73,110 after taxes. But the good news is that you'll pay the vast majority of your taxes while you're still in your career. And that's because 80% of all taxes that are collected come from payroll taxes. So you don't have to replace your entire pre-tax income to retire, because you might pay thousands, if not tens of thousands less dollars in taxes after you quit your job. And this is why how much money you need to retire depends on how much money you spend and not how much money you earn. And this makes a huge difference. Again, in my area, someone earning $100,000 per year would be paying about $27,000 per year on taxes. And using the 4% rule of thumb, an extra $27,000 would require an extra $675,000 in retirement savings, and probably over $750,000 just to be safe. But since taxes could be so much lower in retirement, you don't need to save any of that. And this is another reason that it's actually possible to retire on less than $1 million. And there is one more strategy to reduce how much money you need to retire without reducing your standard of living. And this one might be the most powerful. And I've basically already told you what it is. Remember that one of the biggest costs of working is having to live near where you work. And so many of the good jobs are in big, expensive cities that people end up with very high living costs. But remember that how much money you need to retire depends on how much money you spend after you retire, not on how much money you spend while you're working. And most retirement calculators assume that you'll spend about the same amount of money in retirement as you do while you're in your career. But there is no reason that has to be true. And if you're like me and you only live in the area that you do because of work, then you could massively reduce how much money you spend every year just by moving to a cheaper area after you retire. You could have the exact same standard of living, but you could be spending tens of thousands less dollars. And let me show you just how powerful this can be. Where I live, an income of $90,000 per year is recommended just for a single person, and $227,000 for a family. In a city like San Francisco, the recommended income rises to $109,000 for an individual or $237,000 per year for a family. It would take millions of dollars to retire in those cities, at least for the average person. But in a city like Springfield, Missouri, the recommended income is just $27,600 for a single person and less than $42,000 per year for a family. And that means you could probably retire there on less than $1 million. And this is a huge part of of my own plan to retire on $714,285.71 or less. So let me break it down. As I mentioned, I live in an extremely expensive area, but that also means that I have a high-paying job. And since I know I can move once I decide to retire, I would much rather do my saving in an expensive city. Because if I can save 50% of my income in an expensive city, then those savings will go a lot further in a cheaper area. And think about it this way. Saving 50% of a San Francisco income and retiring to Springfield, Missouri is a whole lot easier than saving 50% of a Springfield, Missouri income and trying to retire to San Francisco. But even in the expensive area that I live in, I still manage to spend about $20,000 per year. Again, the guide in the description breaks down 50 different ways that I save money. And those strategies help me save tens of thousands of dollars per year. But I probably won't be this frugal forever. I'll probably want to spend at least a little more money as I get older. But I still think that I could live very comfortably on less than $25,000 per year, especially after moving to a cheaper area. Assuming I need 25 times my annual expenses before I can retire, which would enable a 4% withdrawal rate, then I would need $625,000 in retirement savings. But since I plan on such a long retirement, I'll probably be even safer. Using a 3.5% withdrawal rate, I would need $714,285.71 to retire early. In reality, I could retire on even less than that if I moved to a way cheaper city, or even better, a cheaper country. And plus, as long as people keep smashing the like and subscribe button, I might earn some money from this YouTube channel too. But either way, I've shown you that it's more than possible to retire on less than $1 million. I've explained 3 strategies to reduce how much money you need to retire without reducing your standard of living, and I've explained how I plan to retire early on less than $1 million. So here's what I want you to do. First, I want you to think about where you would like to retire. Try to come up with at least 3 places that are cheaper than where you currently live that you think you would be happy to retire to. And don't limit your search to the country you live in. Moving abroad could be way more powerful. And once you've found a few places that you think you could retire to, I want you to pick at least one of them and try to estimate exactly how much money you would need to spend to live there for a year. And even if it's just a few thousand less dollars per year than where you currently live, that could be the difference in hundreds of thousands of dollars in retirement savings that you wouldn't need to save. So if you want to retire on less than $1 million, this is a great place to start. And even better, becoming a millionaire might be a lot easier than you think. You could probably retire early as a millionaire, even if the only thing you did was save $1 per hour. But that strategy will only work if you start as soon as possible. So check out this video right here for more details.